I used to live and do research and engage in humanitarian work in northern Laos, specifically the northwest of Laos, an area where in many ways the map was wiped clean by the American Army. So the clock was reset. The U.S. Army there, the Northwest, they didn't rely so much on aerial bombardment. They didn't rely so much on airplanes to destroy villages. They were able to use more soldiers on foot with the almighty Zippo lighter, going from village to village and forcing all of the population to leave and burning down the buildings that remained and so on. So there was a militarily enforced mass migration that in most areas where I was, specifically northwest of Laos, reduced the population to zero. Now, in some cases, those people were moved into refugee camps. In some cases, they just moved into larger cities, several days' march away. And yeah, there were actually cases where they were put into tents and massacred. I've seen some documentary evidence of that, I guess probably just because they became inconvenient for the U.S. Army to relocate. Nevertheless, this relates to the topic of this video in the following rather dynamic way. Ask yourself, Isaac, when Isaac was making his impassioned argument in favor of quote-unquote race realism, in favor of a racist view of how DNA determines intelligence, I pointed out to him that there are circumstances in the world where you can compare two villages on the map, this area of northern Laos, where everything was destroyed and then they started rebuilding the village at the same point in history. Like after the war with the Americans ended, the school was built in two villages at the same time. People started to emerge from illiteracy and absolute poverty at the same time. Economic development happened at the same pace. Like, for example, they both had no electricity and then received electricity at the same time, where really you had about the same advantages and disadvantages over maybe a 50-year period even, and where you could claim that DNA was really a decisive or major variable in separating the two villages. Now, the ethnic groups of Laos do belong to completely different language families, and there are really significant ethnic differences between people, all of whom may be referred to as Laotian, especially in that part of Laos. It is very, very, very ethnically diverse, and it is very linguistically diverse and culturally diverse. So you could look at a village that is entirely populated by the Aka. The Aka are one ethnic group, and you could compare them to a village of people who are Hmong. Hmong is spelled Hmong. You could look at a village that is Tai Lu and compare it to a village that is Tai Deng. You could compare people who are part of the Mon Khmer language family. They are very ethnically different from the Tai Kadai language family, and all living close together in the same climate with, broadly speaking, many of the same economic advantages and disadvantages. So I said to him, if you or any of these people were sincerely interested in the relationship between ethnicity and IQ, why wouldn't you be looking at this sort of circumstance? Why would you be engaged in the insincere arguments, from my perspective, insincere arguments that you are, looking at, Georgia in the United States of America or Texas or what have you, and pretending that socioeconomic factors and indeed explicitly political factors do not explain what you call the quote-unquote achievement gap for things like home ownership in the United States of America. If you guys don't know, you can just Google redlining. Redlining is a term, it's a simple term that combines a pretty complex phenomenon that ultimately comes down to federal government policy in the United States of America. But it includes the fact that black people in the United States were forced to live in ghettos, that they were not able to buy property that white people were able to buy, that they were not able to get bank loans to own a home. These were political decisions ultimately made by the President of the United States of America. That's where they all trace back to, these directives, and carried out by government functionaries, and then ultimately implemented by banks and property development corporations. At the end of World War II, look at the benefit package that a white war veteran received, very often directly linked to free education and housing and house ownership, what was provided for white soldiers at the end of World War II, the opportunities they had, and then look at the situation of a black war veteran, African-American war veteran at the end of World War II. It's a really stark difference, and this is not ancient history. This is history that directly impacts my generation. I'm 40 years old, by the way, and I know this impacted my own family and so on and so forth. You're talking about a situation of very dynamic inequality, very directly linked when talking about African Americans and white European Americans in the United States of America. And it's even more absurd. You want to talk about Indigenous Canadians. So the Cree, the Ojibwe, the Mohawk, the Inuit, I really did engage them Socratically. Like, how much do you know about the political history of what an Indian reservation is, like economically and governmentally? I remember asking him specifically, like, you do realize that the school on an Indian reservation is not provided by the provincial government? Like, do you realize, like, legislatively and politically, like, there are differences in education that both exist on paper and in reality. And of course, that's changed a lot in the last 50 years. We are not in a position in Canada to pretend that we're comparing people in a laboratory where all variables other than DNA have been controlled. Now, it's also true that if you did this kind of research in northern Laos, where there are fewer uncontrolled variables, where you can say, look, the American army came in here and completely demolished everything. And then the Communist Party resettled these people in villages, basically tribal villages of separate ethnicities speaking separate languages. They all built their first school at the same time. They dug the first water well at the same time. They started farming rice or what have you. You could intentionally design a study where you pick a cluster of villages that are as similar as possible, where you try to get rid of other variables. So, for example, you only pick villages that farm rice, and you exclude villages that farm pineapples or some other crop. You pick a bunch of villages that are absolutely as similar as possible in every way. One of the main ones would be access to a highway, access to electricity, these kinds of things. You try to narrow it down as much as possible so that you could look at genetic differences between these people. And still, the role of DNA in this, I'll say a little bit more about why I am so skeptical, would be minuscule compared to the significance of language. Now look, Isaac, again, is someone who has none of this experience. He's someone who speaks out of crass ignorance to some extent, and he's someone who speaks out of an echo chamber of, fascist, racist apologists who just recycle talking points from J. Philippe Rushton and the bell curve and what have you. Try to take scientific racism and make it seem respectable in these contexts. Why am I so skeptical about ethnicity and DNA? I'm going to digress at this point, I guess, to say this. Around the year 1965, it would have been very easy for people to generalize about Chinese people's ability to drive a car, in the United States, Chinese Americans, how well they could drive a car, how well they do on driving tests. And it would be completely absurd to claim that this was because of a genetic hereditary property in Chinese people around 1965 that impaired their ability to drive a car. Very obviously, around the year 1965, you could look at the conditions Chinese people had grown up in China, like their access to a car, how many of them really had grown up with a car. And then even if they had a car, what type of car they drove, in what conditions, what kind of roads, what kind of laws, and then that these are people who made the transition, maybe from growing up in China between 1940 and 1965, and then they immigrate to the United States of America and pass a driving test, and now have to deal with totally different road conditions. Having a driver's license, statistically speaking, is a very powerful predictor for economic outcomes, and even how well you do on your driver's license. And one of the main excuses given for racism linked to IQ is the idea that IQ has statistically powerful predictive power for how much money you're going to earn. Well, a lot of that is negative in the following sense. If you have a driver's license, you can access employment, you can drive to a job interview. If you have a driver's license, it means you're not visually impaired, you're not blind, it means you don't have a range of physical disabilities that would impair you. There are a lot of things excluded just by performing well on a driving test. You probably don't have verbal and facial tics and twitches or nervous condition that would prevent you from driving, and that would also impair your ability to be economically successful in our society most of the time. That would make it much more difficult for you to be an economic success story. So there's a very, very powerful link between having a driver's license and economic success. It's also true that the type of people who learn to drive young and learn to drive well are probably people who grow up with privilege, et cetera, people who didn't just immigrate from China. Now, another culture I know well, by the way, I speak, read, and write Chinese. I used to live in Cambodia, where I studied the Cambodian language. You had a lot of immigrants coming from Cambodia to the United States of America, and specifically coming from refugee camps. So if you told me there is a difference in how well those people perform on their driving tests, that Cambodians perform more poorly in getting a driver's license, or even that they are worse drivers in the United States of America, I can say right away, of course it's not genetic. Of course it's not DNA. Have you been to Cambodia? Even worse, have you been to a Cambodian refugee camp? Do you know where these people come from? And even if someone makes the further argument that they want to believe driving ability, how well you do on a driver's license, that it's hereditary. Because they say, well, look, on the second generation, the children of these people who came from Cambodia, who came from refugee camps, they also perform worse. Well, obviously, this is, whether you call this culture or pico-culture, it's going to be to a lesser extent, but yeah, maybe if you grow up with a father who's a terrible driver and who normalizes really poor driving because he grew up driving in a totally different culture, totally different system of roads and condition, different cars and everything else, really, really different situation growing up driving in Cambodia, sure, maybe there's some influence there that passes on. Obviously, when we're talking about the status of African Americans in the United States, you're talking about a situation of dynamic, enforced inequality, not random inequality, that was created and sustained by very clear government policies, including redlining, including what happened at the end of World War II in terms of veterans benefits and so on, and including, slavery. Have you heard of that? And what happened in the process of reparations and resettlement and integration of black people into white society. A very slow process indeed. Some of it didn't happen overnight with the end of the United States Civil War. So sure, there are long-term knock-on effects in economic and educational attainment from that history that are completely obvious to everyone who has any sincere interest in the social sciences, and he was not trying to cynically weaponize these differences and attribute them to DNA. Now, why do I take this approach? It is because very fundamentally, I am an IQ skeptic. I regard the IQ test as being just as meaningless as a driver's license. And in the same sense, it is meaningful precisely at the low end of the spectrum. IQ is really important in a legal context of establishing, are you responsible for committing murder? Are you responsible? There are people who are severely mentally disabled, mentally impaired. IQ tests can be very important in countries where the government will give someone benefits if they're so stupid and so mentally impaired that they really can't hold a job, or they struggle to even buy groceries for themselves. So there are gradations of intelligence at the low end that are quite important to be able to test empirically. By the same token, there are gradations at the low end that the driver's license tests that's what they're established to measure. What we really want to know is, are you a danger to yourself and others on the road? A driver's license test does not establish your brilliance. It does not establish how excellent a driver you could be at the upper end. Are you a stunt car driver? Are you a racing driver? Can you perform extraordinarily well under pressure? The whole test is set up, it's calibrated and intended to regulate and enforce at the low end of the spectrum, and that's where it's meaningful. But if you know anything about social science tests, again, I have a formal university degree in political science. Isaac has absolutely no education whatsoever. He doesn't know how to analyze social science statistics. He's never done this kind of computation or doesn't have this kind of background education. Just by excluding the people at the low end of the range, the people who are, for example, blind, that will itself produce the statistical artifact of a person with a driver's license and a person with a high score on their driving test being more financially and economically successful in every way at every stage of their life. Now, of course, also being born wealthy is going to result in you doing better on your driving test, statistically speaking, on the scale of a society of 100 million people. People who are born wealthier have access to opportunities like owning a car that make it easier for them to practice driving, learning to drive. They have the money to hire a professional teacher and go to school. They have all kinds of advantages because of their wealth that will show up in the driver's license test, whether they just barely pass or pass really well. They have advantages over a Cambodian immigrant, especially a Cambodian immigrant who comes from a refugee camp, at every stage of that process. And indirectly, their driver's license test is going to map to those other scores, outcomes, and achievements. So in the same way, when you're talking about the IQ test, yeah, sure, there's going to be a relationship between performance on the IQ test and real-world wealth and outcomes. But, there's also going to be a pretty strong correlation between how wealthy your parents were and how wealthy you are, right? Is anyone in any doubt about this? And there's a pretty strong correlation between what happened to your grandfather at the end of World War II. For me, it's only my grandfather. Both of my grandparents served in World War II. So the deal they got in terms of education and benefits, my two grandfathers at the end of World War II, completely explains my socioeconomic status today. 100%, right? It's not distant. So the way black people in America were treated at the end of World War II is an incredibly powerful formative factor for their status today. And the history of segregation, redlining, ghettoization, black people being unable to get a loan to buy and own a house, unable to buy a house that's in a white-only neighborhood, property developments being openly racist and excluding black people, access to employment, whether or not they can even have certain classes of job, access to education, et cetera, et cetera. These things, if you just talk about the end of World War II to present, of course, they improved dramatically in the decade of the 1980s. The status of African Americans in the 1980s improved absolutely fabulously. The decade of the 1980s compared to the decade of the 1950s, there is no comparison. Things improved amazingly. It's also true that if you're a refugee who moves from Cambodia to Long Beach, California, materially your life improves in all these ways. But nevertheless, there are knock-on effects for yourself and maybe even for your children in how well you can drive a car, how well you can compete in this economy, et cetera, et cetera. So coming back to the question of northern Laos, of small villages that could be more closely comparable in terms of their history, where you could be looking more at the effect of DNA on intelligence. It's also true that the effect of DNA is going to be trivial, absolutely trivial, compared to language. Right? Now, two factors real quick, language and religion. Okay? So even if we have this study, we pick villages that are perfectly comparable, same level of education, same level access to electricity, farm, everything's the same. Guess what? Tailu people grow up speaking Tailu. Hmong people grow up speaking Hmong. Mon Khmer people grow up speaking one of the Mon Khmer languages, let's say Khmu, Khmu. Okay, so let's say that's what we're comparing. You don't think that factor alone makes a difference in what they can read and what they do read? Like, the difference growing up in these three profoundly different language families, without even getting into the psychology of language acquisition, like to what extent does growing up speaking Chinese actually change the way you perceive reality versus growing up speaking English? That's an interesting question. But on a shallower level, what can you read in the Khmu language growing up? Right? Even radio. So let's say all three of those languages, you grow up listening to the radio in your own language. They didn't grow up listening to the same things on radio. Okay? How about religion? So let's say we're talking about Hmong people who are Christian, Tailu people who are Theravada Buddhist, and Khmu people who still practice tribal animism, a religion we don't really have ancestor worship, ghost worship, spirit worship. The Tai Dang also very animistic, organized religion. The Aka, very complex system of animism called Akazan. You don't think that's going to make a difference much more profound in their daily life, in their perception of reality, in what kind of intelligence they cultivate and what they do with it? And can these differences even be captured by an IQ test? I don't think in a meaningful sense they'd be captured by a driving test either. This is also part of my criticism of the IQ test. I don't think the IQ test tells us what it is that we want to know. So guys, this video is past 20 minutes. I could say more. Not a lot of people expressed sincere interest in hearing me explain what it was that I discussed when I confronted Ask Yourself Isaac about his racist views, to put it that way. It is very clear to me that Isaac is a guy who was initially influenced by J. Philippe Rushton, and especially a debate that took place between J. Philippe Rushton and David Suzuki. These are people who are famous in Canada, but they're not really so famous in the United States or Europe, and that debate is on YouTube. I just mentioned David Suzuki is an idiot. He really is. However, J. Philippe Rushton is a racist who has been so thoroughly discredited that if you even just look at his Wikipedia article, it will be obvious to you, what, did Isaac even look into this for 5 minutes? And the answer is no, he did not. Isaac was really influenced by seeing this debate between J. Philippe Rushton and David Suzuki. He lived in an echo chamber of people who reinforced his attitudes again and again. And that only ended when he became friends with a medical doctor called Dr. Avi. Dr. Avi, I saw the chilling effect that Dr. Avi really put him in check on this. That once he became friends with Dr. Avi, he suddenly got much more circumspect and evasive about what his views on race and IQ were. But he got into a pattern that's easily refutable, Isaac, of bullying people by saying to them, well, you can't possibly believe that IQ is equally distributed throughout all ethnic groups for the same reasons that you can't possibly believe that height is equally distributed throughout all racial groups. And then he proceeded with a series of kind of bullying and really false and quite easy to refute arguments about race and IQ from there. Isaac is a weak-willed, weak-minded person who has no sincere interest in the use of philosophy, reason, or logic for his own benefit, for humanity's benefit, or anybody's benefit. He's only interested when it makes him feel powerful and strong and influential and smart and important, and he becomes afraid of it as soon as it challenges him, as soon as it makes him feel weak and humble and that he's done something wrong and that he needs to go and read a book. So it was very challenging for him to hear from me that he lives in a country that's built on genocide, that there's this whole important history literally right under his feet of why Canada is the way it is and why the status and situation of our native peoples is so unequal. And that no, you absolutely cannot explain the current situation of the Cree and Ojibwe within Canada in terms of their quote-unquote genetic inferiority. This is not just racist, it's false, it's easily refuted, and it's insane. Now, I have to give him credit. He was cordial. He heard this, and he responded, and the discourse went on in some depth and some length. And I think it's very meaningful that the final conclusion this came to, what it revealed, in a Socratic sense, what was disambiguated in the conversation, was that Isaac said of himself that his fundamental concern is that Canada should stay the same, that in its ethnic composition, he did not want Canada to change. And he said, I mean, this is part of his justifying that he's not racist, he doesn't just mean that he wants Canada to remain dominated by white Christians, but he said that he wants Canada to basically retain the same composition where some small percentage is Indigenous. I guess he doesn't want that to increase. He's also saying that he's not racist in the sense that it's not that he personally wants to see the Indigenous people disappear. Yeah, well, thanks. This is not much of a concession. What I pointed out to him in response to that was that is fundamentally conservative. I said, well, your position is all you're saying is that ultimately this is the status quo that you know and that you're willing to defend it, that you want to uphold it. I said, my situation is that I am fundamentally a dissident. I am very dissatisfied with Canada and what it is in many ways, including the legacy of colonialism and genocide, including racism, but including many, many other things with Canadian society. I am so dissatisfied with Canadian society that I regard immigration and changes in the ethnic composition of Canada, changes in the language spoken in Canada, I regard that positively just because there is at least the possibility of radical and fundamental change in Canada. I am so dissatisfied with Canadian society, I'm interested in that radical and fundamental change, even if it makes things worse. So I have no illusions that Chinese people are superior to white people. I speak, read, and write Chinese. But if you ask me, do I think Chinese immigration to Canada is a good thing? My fundamental reason for thinking it is a good thing is that at least it raises new questions. It results in new openness, new challenges, and the possibility of positive change in a country that has a political system that I despise, has a system of education that I despise. It has a system that I would like to see disrupted and challenged and to take on new directions. So that is not how Isaac feels. And Isaac was led down a path first through flattery, because these racist views, as presented by people like J. Philippe Rushton, as presented by Steven Pinker, as presented by Sam Harris, they are fundamentally flattering to him. We had a funny situation the other day here. You may have noticed just yesterday I uploaded a video with a guy named Muhammad. Muhammad's family is from the greater Palestine area, mostly Jordan, but his family history is part of the Palestinian experience and how the rise of Israel disrupted and destroyed the civilization that existed there before. British Empire also has a lot of the blame before the state of Israel, but whatever. And I pointed out to him, we were talking about the politics of Israel, Palestine, the British Empire. I said, it's really pathetic that we live in an era when I am considered extraordinary for being opposed to apartheid. When I am opposed, well, it's extraordinary that I'm opposed to apartheid when it could benefit me. When for me, as someone who's ethnically Jewish, I could benefit from this apartheid. I said, sitting here on the same couch, here's Melissa. Melissa's a white American who is not of Jewish ancestry. We don't think it's remarkable that Melissa is opposed to an apartheid system that would benefit her, and that historically in the past did benefit her or people like her. The point is, back when there was apartheid in the United States of America, people like Melissa benefited. She has blue eyes. More blue. Okay, Hazel, what do you go with? Okay, she prefers Hazel. To me, they look blue. In bright light, they look blue. Anyway, this is a fair-skinned white person of mixed European ancestry. She was one of the beneficiaries of that system of apartheid, but we completely assume and expect her to be opposed to apartheid even when it benefits her. And yet it's remarkable. It's considered remarkable for me to oppose apartheid when it would benefit me. Isaac, and all the people like Isaac, it should not be remarkable. It should not be exceptional for people like you to oppose scientific racism, even when it benefits you, even when it's flattering to you, even when people like Steven Pinker are telling you that you're special and that you're intelligent because of your blood. You're not. None of us are.